This is the story of fair Sita. Sita is the loveliest of all the maids. She has wonderful black hair, shiny black hair, which goes clear down to her waist in wonderful tresses. She has a moon-shaped face, a gentle neck, great bosoms, wonderful great bosoms, a slender waist, and great hips. She is described as doe-eyed, almond-eyed, dove-eyed, partridge-eyed, lotus-eyed Sita, the loveliest of all the maids. And this is her story, and we will follow her life from early adulthood, where we first find her, until an ending which has the nobility hard to equal. But the story begins with two youths, because they play such a large part in her life. And the two youths are Shridaman and Nanda. And Shridaman is a Brahmin, and he's the son of a Brahmin, and he's the grandson of a Brahmin, and he's the great-grandson of a Brahmin, and he's the great-great-grandson of a Brahmin. And Shridaman has a great head, spends most of his time thinking, and a little bent, shaped like a bent cucumber body, which seemed always overtaxed carrying that great head about. And his bosom friend, Nanda, who is a goat herder and is very low caste, and Nanda has a sloping forehead, nose something reminiscent of the goat which he spent so much time with, but he has a wonderful, wonderful, sleek, muscly, fine, shiny body that is never tired and has an indistinguishable lucky calf mark on the hairs of his chest. Well, Shridaman and Nanda are blood brothers, which doesn't mean what we mean by blood brothers. In India, every youth early on, long before his marriage, makes a blood relationship with another youth, and that is that they exchange blood as a vow of friendship and devotion to each other for the rest of their lives. That is what is involved in having a blood brother, and this lasts the whole of lifetime. Well, Shridaman and Nanda are blood brothers, and you could scarcely imagine two different characters enjoying each other, which is partly why the tie is so close. Where Shridaman is strong, Nanda is weak, and where Shridaman is weak, Nanda is strong. And this makes for a wonderful exchange and safety and brotherhood back and forth. Well, Shridaman and Nanda spend most of their time together. They seem inseparable. Life doesn't seem to work very well if either is parted from the other. Shridaman and Nanda, I think it was Shridaman who began this, and he had to go off on some Brahmanic business somewhere or another. And Nanda, of course, had to find some comparable journey so he could go along. So he found some goat herder's business that required him to go in the same direction. And the two of them set off, and Shridaman, tired before he began. It's so tiring to carry around a Brahman's head like that, which is so active and occupies so much of one's life. I think he was born tired. And Nanda never tires with that wonderful, wonderful, sleek, muscly body of his. It was indefatigable. They set off, and of course Nanda carried the baggage for both of them. And they traveled until noontime. The heat of the day overtook them. They sat down beside a holy stream, a tributary to the Ganges, to rest and to avoid the heat of the day and to have their lunch. So they were quibbling back and forth as close friends often do. And Sridaman would correct Nanda in some Vedic pattern or another. And Nanda would get back at him and remind him where Sridaman was not all that adequate too. But they were enjoying each other immensely. Nanda heard a sound which seemed inept at that moment and that place, and he peered around from in back of the bush where they were taking some shade, and he beheld the most ravishingly beautiful maiden, and of course it's Sita. And she, thinking that she's alone, has disrobed herself and is walking down the steps which disappear down below the surface of the water in the holy stream to do her noonday ablutions. Nanda whispers to Sridaman, and he says, "Sridaman, there's a fair maiden going down the steps to do her ablution." And Sridaman peers around the corner, and he said, "But it is forbidden that we should lay eye upon a maiden, let alone an unclothed maiden." And Nanda says, "Well, Sridaman, you're always telling me that we have to take the dark sides of life, and when fate brings something pleasant, is it not logical that we should take that as a fateful event also?" And it's amazing how quickly somebody can be argued into something that he wishes. So both boys sat peering about the shrub that they were in back of, watching this incredibly beautiful sight. For there's nothing more beautiful in all of the world than a high-born Indian maiden walking. She walks with the grace of a goddess, and especially should she be descending the steps into a holy place to do her ablutions, nothing is so graceful in all of the world. Well, the two boys watched. Sita, thinking she was unseen, finished her bathing, ascended the steps again with that inimitable grace which is her characteristic, clothed herself, and walked away. Now, this is an Indian story, as you can easily see, and it is the duty of a storyteller to warn you should some untoward event be coming up in the story, lest your sensibilities be irrevocably damaged. So, the storyteller has to tell you that a great breach of reality, a breach of caste, a breach of the relationship between young man and young woman has occurred, and a dreadful scene is about to come, so brace yourself. Not for the last time in our story either. When Sita is out of earshot, Nanda says, "I have held that girl in my arms." And you have no idea as a Westerner what a blasphemous, audacious statement this is. Because no Indian youth would ever touch a maiden. Not until after the wedding ceremony, and that would be his wife. Sridaman is shocked, speechless, because the disobeying of Brahmanic principles like this is unheard of. He is shaken to the core. And Nanda quickly explains that this occurred at the enticement of the sun. And I have to do a side story now to tell you about the festival of the enticement of the sun. Every year in old India, on the 21st of December, they do a ceremony to entice the sun to come back, because the sun has been diminishing up to that point. And if they don't make a sufficiently attractive enticement, he might just continue diminishing and go away and leave the world without light. So the ceremony consists that the village chooses the best boy, the strongest lad, and they search the countryside for the fairest maiden, And at high noon on December 21st, the strong lad takes the girl in his arms and he tosses her up into the air as far up toward the sun as he possibly can. And this is the offering of the sun, and it's an absolutely foolproof ceremony because the sun has always turned around and come back with an enticement like that. But should the custom fall into disuse, no one can guarantee that the sun would ever come back again. Well, Nanda had been the youth and Sita had been the fair maiden. So Sita had indeed been in the arms of Nanda legitimately. Sridaman, who talks a great deal, was strangely silent at this. The boys had to part way at this point. They were going different directions. So they divided out the things they had to carry. Sridaman, with his bent cucumber body, went off his way, and Nanda, with his great strength, went off his own way. They agreed to meet at that same point 3 days later. So 3 days have elapsed, and the boys come back. And of course Nanda comes first, because Sridaman just can't keep up with all of this. Nanda is sitting in the shade, and he sees Sridaman coming at a great distance, and he is even more bent over and more tired and more dejected than his usual posture. And Nanda knows Sridaman so well that he knows poor Sridaman has been caught in a mood, but Nanda knows exactly what to do with him. So Nanda goes out, takes his burden from his hands. Now Sridaman, what's happened to you? You're behaving with all the dignity of a monkey just freshly fallen out of a tree. What's the matter? And Sridaman, in his usual dramatic style, says, Nanda, it is too terrible. Simply go and gather the wood for a funeral pyre and cool my suffering in the flames of the pyre. And Nanda says, oh, rubbish. And but Sridaman continues with this, and he said, Nanda, do your last act of love and devotion to me, and go and gather the wood for a funeral pyre, because nothing else will cool my suffering but the flames of a funeral pyre. Nanda knows just what to do. He's been through this before with Sridaman. And he said, all right, I will, but you must understand, I will build a funeral pyre for two, because if you leave this world, I can't possibly stay on the face of the earth, and it will be a funeral pyre for two. This startled Sridaman so much that Nanda saw that he had made a point and said, and I won't do it at all unless you tell me what's happened. And Sridaman said, I have fallen in love with Sita, and I cannot live one more day on the face of the earth without my beloved. And Nanda said, well, now wait, there are much less drastic things to do about that than a funeral pyre. You're the catch of the countryside. You're the most eligible bachelor, being a Brahmin and being an inheritor of fine things. And with your permission, I will go to Sita's parents and do the courtship for her. This had never occurred to Sridaman, and he perked up a bit and he said, do you think they would have me? And Nanda said, of course, you're the most eligible bachelor in the whole countryside now. I should explain to you that if you go courting in India, you send your best friend to do the courting, because you must never lay eye upon your beloved until after you are married. The marriage ceremony consists of 5 days of ceremony, night and day, and both bride and groom are so bowered with flowers that they can't see. There's just a cascade and a tumult of flowers over both of them. And they're led through the funeral ceremony. Funeral ceremony. Wedding ceremony. Without seeing each other. And only after the bride has been led by the groom 7 times around the camphor fire are the flowers taken away, and bride and groom see each other for the first time. Store this away, please, because it's a large part of our story in a minute or two. But you send your best friend to court the girl for you, so that she may not see you and you may not see her, and the laws not be broken in that manner. So Nanda went off and asked Sita's parents, and of course they refused, which is a matter of face. And a month later he went and asked again, and you must refuse 3 times, and you may, if you wish, say yes on the 4th time. If you ever go to India, you must understand that if you offer something to someone, they'll refuse 3 times, and it's the 4th one which matters. So on the 4th one, yes, they agreed. And an astrologer was engaged, and the formalities were gone through, and Sita's parents visited Sridaman's parents, and Sridaman's parents visited Sita's parents. And so it went, and the wedding date was set. And the wedding took place, all 5 days of it. And now storyteller has to warn you that there's a dreadful moment coming, so brace yourself. The flowers were lifted, and Sita looked upon her husband for the first time, and horror of horrors, Sridaman looked upon his bride for the 2nd time, and you know we're in for a very bad time. This won't do. This just is not possible. Too many vital, basic laws are broken at this moment, so dreadful things are in store. Sridaman and Sita go off to their new house, and of course Nanda comes along. Nanda couldn't live without this, so it's a household of 3. And you don't need warning to know what that means. Everything goes well, and they're happy with each other. And Sridaman is so much Sridaman, and Nanda is so much Nanda, and Sita is so much the lovely Sita. And Sita is soon with child, but now here is the worst of all, and you must grasp the side of your seat carefully lest you be shocked out of equilibrium by this. Sita discovers that, to borrow language from the Western convents, she lost custody of her eyes and found herself looking at Nanda most of the time. And she tried and tried and tried her best to keep her eyes off this wonderful, sleek, muscly body with the lucky calf mark in the hairs of his chest, but she simply couldn't keep her eyes off him. And Sridaman, not at all prepossessing in appearance, is her lawful husband, of course. And this is a situation almost beyond repair. In fact, the repair of this dilemma is the culmination of the story and requires the utmost from both its characters, the storyteller, and you, the audience. As everyone knows, if something has gone wrong inside, the first thing anybody does is to tell everybody outside how well things are going. This is universal and may be taken for granted. So in their increasing embarrassment, which none will acknowledged to any of the others, they decide that they're going to make a trip to Sita's parents and show them how well the marriage is going and tell them the good news of the impending birth. Nanda gets the dromedary cart out, hitches up the dromedary. Nanda sits on the front seat, and Sita and Sridaman sit in the back seat, strangely quiet. Well, as anybody knows, if you're lost inside, it's not very long before you're lost outside. That's just axiomatic. And Nanda made a wrong turning somewhere in the afternoon, and by evening time he had made another wrong turning, and the road had turned into a lane, and the lane had turned into a path, and by sunset the path had petered out, and they were nowhere in the forest, just as you might presume. And they could do nothing but spend the night there. They spent a dreadful night. Mosquitoes, pestilence, all the things of misery, and the three of them were taxed absolutely to the limit. At the first bit of the light of dawn, Sridaman awoke first, if any of them had slept at all. And one is never very far away from a temple in India, and he sees that they have bogged down near a Kali temple. And I have to tell you about a Kali temple. It's simply horrible. To our Western eyes, it's just not understandable at all. Because the goddess Kali is a solidified nightmare of Vishnu, and is the most horrible thing going. She has 18 arms, and each arm and hand is holding something more horrible than the last. There's a skull in one hand, there's a snake in another, there's a bowl of blood in yet another, there's a snake wound around, still another, and it's so on, it goes up to 18. She has the teeth of a wolf, hair of snakes, and she has to be fed fresh blood every day of her life. And this is the goddess Kali, one of the great feminine deities. I must put in a note of apology or explanation here. When the dark aspects of life, be they masculine or feminine, are portrayed and acknowledged and given a place of worship, they're much less likely to turn up in human beings. And that's the great wisdom of India. To worship Kali is to proof one's house against Kali. Sridaman said to the other two, "Give me 5 minutes while I go in and pay my respects to Kali." So he went in, and here's this terrible, terrible monster, Kali, with her 18 arms and the terrible things. And someone had preceded him and had sacrificed a goat and put the blood into the scuppers around the basin in front of the goddess. And Sridaman was kneeling there, thinking about the desperate situation he was in, for though he had not allowed anyone to know, he had seen what was going on and could not cope with it. He didn't know what to do. He was torn in the cruelest possible way between the two beloveds of his life, Sita and Nanda. There was no way out. So in a moment of desperation, he took the knife from his side and he cut off his head. And with his last moment of breath, he said to the goddess Kali, the least I can do, or the only thing I know to do, is to pour out my lifeblood to you and make a sacrifice to the goddess. Nanda and Sita sitting in the dromedary cart, are exceedingly ill at ease with each other, and nobody's eyes seem to know what to do. What they wanted to do was impossible, and what they didn't want to do was equally impossible. Sita burst forth in irritability and said, "Nanda, that husband of mine, he's probably gone off into samadhi and will be there for half a day in his ecstasy while we're eaten by mosquitoes out here. Go in and tell him that somebody exists in the world beside himself." So Nanda goes in, and storyteller has to warn you now that a dreadful moment is approaching. And Nanda, glad to be out of the tension of sitting in the dromedary cart and guilty at having lost their way, sees the disaster of his life before him, the blood pouring out of his beloved Sridaman, and without thought, for Nanda was virtually without thought, took the knife from the still quivering hand of his beloved Sridaman and cut off his own head and added his blood to the sacrifice to the goddess Kali. Sita was by herself, and some 10 minutes later she burst into another fit of temper and said, "Those two boys, they've probably gotten into some theological discussion, and they've forgotten that I'm out here being eaten by mosquitoes, and there can be a half a day in there and never think about me." So irritably she went in, and you can imagine what happened to her when she saw the total and absolute ruin of her life before her. Because her husband and her beloved and virtually her whole life lay ebbing out its blood before her. She was a widow, and a lot of a widow in India, sometimes called the White Death. She staggered out of the temple, not believing her eyes, and drew some breaths of fresh air, and went back in to see again, and it was only too true. So she staggered back out of the temple and was pulling down a vine from the banyan tree to wrap around her neck to hang herself, because life is not bearable from this moment onward. And as she was transferring her weight to the vine on the banyan tree, a hoarse voice issued forth from the temple, "Sita!" It was the goddess herself who had come down off her throne and was at the entrance to the temple, commanding Sita. Sita froze in her tracks and turned around, and here was the goddess with all of her 18 arms facing her. And the goddess said, "Sita, it is all your fault, and it is you who have killed the two boys." And the goddess recites all that Sita had done and all the things that had gone wrong, and Sita is just overwhelmed with this. The goddess said, "Now take that vine from off your neck, because I sentence you to the one fate that is worse than death, and that is, I sentence you to life. And especially since another life is coming, you must live, and there's no way for you to escape this." Sita threw herself in a flood of tears and compassion and confession before the goddess, and implored so fervently that even the hard heart of Kali with her 18 arms and her terrible visage relented and said, "All right, if you go in quickly and put the heads back on the boys, they will live. Now make sure you put them on straight so you don't have one of them looking backward, or the poor boy will be the laughing stock of the village forever." And Sita, scarcely believing this, went in and lifted one of the heads by its hair, a grisly task, but no more so than the sight of Kali herself, and put it onto the severed neck, and saw the miracle of life quivering in the boy. And having done a miracle once, she picked up the other head and put it on, making care that it faced forward, and saw the miracle of life restored to the other one. And in a few moments' time, there was the most wonderful scene of the three of them standing in the gloom of the Kali temple with life restored. And never is life so precious as when it has just been threatened. The three of them went out into the yard of the temple and began dancing, the three of them arm in arm, with the joy of returned life. But, and now storyteller has to warn you, probably the most seriously of any moment in the whole story, that you must brace yourself for what is coming now, because it is irremediable. They separate from each other, and we see the scene of Nanda standing there, feeling his little, small, inadequate body with his hands, and wondering what has happened. And Sridaman is exploring this muscly, fine, sleek body with the lucky calf mark on the pattern of it, the hair of its chest, wondering what in the world has come over his body to give it this great strength and amplitude. For you see, Sita had transposed the heads, and she'd put Sridaman's head on Nanda's body, and Nanda's head on Sridaman's body. And I have to confess, though it's a little hard to live it down, that when Sita saw this, she issued forth a particularly strange, self-conscious laugh. Because for a moment she thought she had the best of both worlds. Well, scarcely an instant later, a great quarrel, the only quarrel in their history, sprang up between Sridaman and Nanda, because Nanda had reached out to touch Sridaman, to touch Sita's body, and Sridaman, with Nanda's body, said, "You keep your hands off my wife." And Nanda, with Sridaman's body, said, "It is Sridaman's hands which are touching his legitimate wife." And Sridaman reaches out to touch his wife, but he sees that it is Nanda's hands which are activated, and this is not lawful, so he has to stop. And the two boys are absolutely paralyzed in a paradox which simply can't be solved. They set up a great argument, hoping to get it settled now, and Sridaman said, "But the word is stronger than any physical fact, and it was I who said the wedding vows to Sita, so she is my wife." And Nanda said, "Yes, but whose body was it, yours or mine, who conceived her child?" And they went round and round and round and discovered they were in an insoluble tangle. When you're in an insoluble tangle, either inner or outer in India, you go to the nearest holy man and lay it out before him. And his word is law. They knew that they were within 3 days' journey of a very famous holy man in the forest of Dankaka. So they set up the dromedary cart again, and immediately the path is discernible. For when you know where you're going inside, then the outside path is immediately available to you. But there was another bad moment, because who's going to sit next to whom? And it had to be Nanda, even though with Sridaman's body, to sit and manage the dromedary, because it was only Nanda's head who knew what to do with dromedaries. And Sita sat in the back with Sridaman's head, but Nanda's body, and Sridaman was, Sita was not known to object at all during that trip. They made the 3-day journey to the forest of Dankaka, and if we had the time and the leisure for such luxuries, I could regale you for a week of the stories of the things that went on in that 3-day journey. But finally they arrived at the forest of Dankaka. The people around the great holy man were very protective of him, because too many people came and they were pestering the poor old holy man. He had no peace at all. But Sita said to one of the wives what they were going to ask, and the wife was so intrigued with this insoluble dilemma that she agreed to show them the way to the holy man on condition that Sita would bring the results to her on the way back. Well, they went to the holy man, and it seems that Nanda, being terribly inferior because of his grossness and his lack of spirituality and asceticism, had consulted the holy man some years preceding. So when the holy man saw Nanda with Sridaman's body coming, he said, "Ah, Nanda, I told you if you would do the disciplines that you would thin way down and become very ascetic, and I see that it has worked." But Nanda was not at all enthusiastic. And Nanda said, "We have much more difficulty than appears," and poured out all of this story. The poor holy man, he said, "You mortals can get yourself into the most insoluble tangles, and this is the worst I have ever seen, and I will have to meditate for 3 days before I can issue a verdict on this. Now come back in 3 days, and don't bother me." 3 days later they came back, and the holy man said, "My verdict is that Sridaman, though with Nanda's body, is the legal husband of Sita, and Nanda with Sridaman's body, having the stuff of asceticism now visibly incorporated into his life, is to begin meditating under an adjoining banyan tree and become a holy man." So this was fine, and Sridaman with Nanda's body gathered up the dromedary cart, hitched it. The two of them went off to go home. Nanda and Sridaman with Nanda's body, terrified at what he was going to present to his parents. But he needn't have worried, because when his mother saw him coming, she said, "Sridaman, I have never seen you in such fine form. Your body has filled out, and I told you if you just got married, wonderful things would happen to you." So Sridaman was much relieved at that. But they went to their own house. The baby was born in due time. And poor Sita was in a fever of panic. And she got up as soon after the birth as she possibly could and examined the eyes of the new baby, a boy called Samadhi, to see if there was any difficulty with his eyes, because it is the tradition in India that if a woman is not totally focused in devotion upon her husband at the moment of conception, the child will be born blind. But Samadhi's eyes were excellent, and Sita breathed a great sigh of relief, though Samadhi did turn out to be badly nearsighted later in his life. Now, storyteller has to warn you because another dreadful event is in the making. These things don't smooth out as quickly as this, ever. Poor Sita had to stand by and watch the best of both worlds, Sridaman's head and Nanda's wonderful body, wither away, because the head has such profound effect upon the body that the Sridaman head soon turned the Nanda body back into a Sridaman body again. And in a few weeks' time, her husband, Sridaman, with Nanda's body, was Sridaman with a Sridaman-like body again, with all of the muscles gone, and all of the sleekness, and all of the hairs which had made up the lucky calf mark on his chest, all gone. And she knew in her heart of hearts that the reverse had happened to Nanda with Sridaman's body. And she was in such a fever over this that early one morning she hitched up the dromedary cart herself and went off to the forest of Dankaka, so that she could again set eye, illegitimately, on that wonderful Nanda body which had meant so much to her. Sridaman, not observant of such things, had indeed been aware of what was happening, and he also knew that his beloved Nanda would be restored to the physical beauty which was so much his grace and the glory of him. When Sridaman awoke and found that Nanda and Sita and Samadhi were gone, he knew where they had gone. He borrowed a dromedary cart, set out to go to the forest of Dankaka. He arrived a day after and found a scene to tear his heart out, because he arrived early in the morning and he went to Nanda with Sridaman's body, now looking like Nanda again, asleep in his straw hut, with Sita curled up in his arms. And it wasn't terribly dreadful, because she was in the embrace of her legitimate husband, so that's all right. But she was not in the embrace of Sridaman as Sridaman thought of himself. So he quietly backed out and went to the Ganges River a few feet away and sat down to meditate before the great river, never to move again until this insoluble dilemma had been pierced. A little while later, Sita and Nanda, with Sridaman's body restored again to Nanda proportions, came out of their straw hut to do their ablutions in the river, and saw Sridaman with Nanda's body, now grown Sridaman-like again, sitting there. And the three of them approached each other, and without one word, the three again embraced each other. And like that wonderful dance of life, which we had seen before, they understood, without any word between or among them, that any happiness which is won at the unhappiness of another, or any good fortune which is won at the cost of somebody else's bad fortune, or any good which has cost another suffering, or anything of pleasure which has caused a displeasure, is of the world of Maya and not worth the having. And it's Sita who took the initiative, for she knew what to do. And she told Nanda, with Sridaman's body grown strong again now, to go and gather the wood for a funeral pyre for 3. And Nanda quickly had this accomplished. And there is a scene so deeply touching that one can scarcely bear it. Because Sita, she of the lovely black hair and the moon-shaped face and the slender neck and the great bosoms and the slender waist and the great hips, doe-eyed, slow-eyed, dove-eyed, partridge-eyed, lotus-eyed, almond-eyed Sita, she of the rarest of beauty, with the grace that she had once descended the steps to the stream for ablution, ascended the funeral pyre and sat in the center. And Sridaman, her lawful husband, with Nanda's body but grown Sridaman-like now, ascended the funeral pyre and sat at her right hand. And Nanda, with Sridaman's body grown strong again, like Nanda, ascended the funeral pyre and sat at her left. And as is the custom, the oldest remaining male of the line takes a firebrand, lights it from an adjoining funeral pyre, and lights the pyre, and stands in wait until a certain moment in the cremation, which I won't burden you with, is accomplished, and then he may go. And so resolute are the 3 in what they are doing that not one sound escaped from them as the funeral pyre burned.